now about 60 years since I first encountered Bonhoeffer as a student, and then working for the SCM. Way back then, we had a thing called SCM Press, produced lots of documents and books and all sorts of things that enabled us to pass on ideas and issues and new thoughts of various kinds to do with faith and discipleship. And alas, that's no longer with us, but it was certainly a way that things began to get communicated. Today we have the website, of course, and things that didn't exist then do now. So let's hope that in one way and another, your efforts to produce this, which I think is a very good title, Appointments with Bonhoeffer, is very timely. Thank you. I think the best thing to do is to say that at this point in the day, we thought that there would be a time to wind up the statements that we got from Bishop Rose and so on, and see if there were any highlights that we could take up for the further work of Project Bonhoeffer. Every 3 years, PB stops to think about what it's been doing and what it needs to do next. And we're in that process at the moment. And indeed, hopefully, this conference, because of the challenges we know of the time in which we live, as well as what we know about Bonhoeffer, some of which is new or changing in our understanding. And I think if anybody's got any comments on that, and perhaps when Keith has perhaps led us into this, we'll be able to just log them for further attention. Not today, because I don't think we can do much more today, but I think if we could do that, then the conference has an ongoing value for the work of PB. Thank you.
Right, thank you. After this has been such a fantastic, rich and stimulating day so far. I feel what it must be rather like, using a cricket analogy, like being sent into a bat, first fairly well down the order, and the captain comes to you and says, well, there's a huge number of runs on the scoreboard. We've plenty there, enough to declare soon. We'll be declaring in half an hour or so's time. Just go out and have a knock and enjoy yourself for the time being. So I feel a bit like that. I mean, there's so much been said, and it's been so enriching what we've heard, both from Bishop Rose onwards, from Ulrich Schmiedel, and from the contributors, the activist contributors, that one wonders whether there's much more can be said. But the title I gave to this paper was Bonhoeffer and Refugees, a Peace Issue. And I was so glad that the word peace has come up in this day so far, including in Juliet's contribution about peaceful borders. And because I think dealing with refugees is a peace issue. It's about making peace. It's about building relationships between people, between refugees, their hosts, among refugees, hosts, refugees, and the wider community. It's about what happens when relationships are formed, which is what peace is about. And I'm minded to begin by quoting something from Dietrich Bonhoeffer, which was said in a context not of dealing with refugees, but of international peace. A speech he made in 1934 at the Ecumenical Conference on the Danish island of Fanø of the World Alliance for Friendship Through the Churches and the Life and Work movement. When he said this, he said, "Peace is the great venture. It can never be made safe. Peace must be dared. It is the great venture. It can never be made safe." And I think what we've heard a lot of today is that peacemaking in the refugee and asylum context is often venturesome. It is often dangerous and never actually made safe, never guaranteed in its results. But that is true, really, of all human relationships, all attempts to replace conflict, isolation, antagonism, hostility with peaceful community. And of course, we've been reminded often enough today as well that we often seem the language that people use talking about refugees and asylum seekers, you would think we were in a war zone, that we were being invaded by the swarms, by the people threatening our identity, our life as a nation, and so on. So refugees face us with a peacemaking challenge, and in the light of so much of Bonhoeffer's thinking, if we put that thinking put our concerns in the light of what Bonhoeffer was thinking, then we can, I think, have another resource for direction, for guidance. Now, I'm very much aware, even by this late stage in the conference today, that people come at this subject of Bonhoeffer from very different backgrounds. Some people here know a very, very great deal about Bonhoeffer, don't need reminding of his story at all. Others, I know from what people have said, is that Bonhoeffer is not much more than a name to them, of an inspiring figure we should take note of. So I hope that what I'm going to say as we have this sort of tidying up session will neither bore the people who have a great deal of knowledge about Bonhoeffer, nor will it, as it were, intimidate those who say they have little. I hope there'll be something in it for all people. And I want to divide it into two main parts, because we've had so much about the refugee issue today. And I thought it might be interesting just to return to Bonhoeffer in his own context and study some of the things he said and some of the things he experienced about the refugee crisis of his own time. So first of all, I'm going to say a little bit about Bonhoeffer's own engagement with refugees and his immersion in the whole milieu of the refugee crisis of the 1930s, when he was a pastor in London, when he was a leading teacher in the Confessing Church in Germany, that is that section of German Protestants who were resisting the Nazification of the church, its life and its teaching, and when he was working undercover as a member of the political conspiracy against Hitler. What was his own engagement like? What did immersion in this milieu do to him? Secondly, in conclusion, what might we learn certain of Bonhoeffer's famous prison writings, written during his 2 years imprisonment before his death in 1945, not ostensibly about refugees, but in a way very pertinent to our attempt at relationship building in the refugee situation. First of all, a picture, Matt, if you could, the first picture Dave asked you to show up about Bonhoeffer. Now, this is an unusual picture of Bonhoeffer. It's one of my favorite ones. Bonhoeffer, as he was pastor in London between 1933 and 35, pastor of two churches, Sydenham and at Aldgate in more central London. This is a picture of him and two young people he was confirming at the church in Sydenham. And I like the picture because he's so obviously young. He looks hardly older than these two young people. He was, in fact, what is taken in 1934, so he'd have been 28 at the time. And I think it's always worth remembering that Bonhoeffer was a young man for all his short life, relatively speaking. he was outrageously bright, got his doctorate at the age of 21, which is an appallingly advanced age to get it. It was as a youth secretary that he served the ecumenical peace movement. And of course, he was only 39 when he died. So that is Bonhoeffer, the young Bonhoeffer, looking very smart and very cheerful. Thanks, Matt. You can take it off now. He was pastor of these two congregations at Sydenham and in Aldgate. And he'd come almost, but not quite as a refugee in 1933 himself. He got out of Germany. Hitler had been in power since the beginning of that year, 1933. He didn't come as a refugee himself. He came because he was fed up with Germany at the time and the arguments going on in the church about how the so-called German Christians, the Nazi Protestants, could be resisted in taking over the church. Bonhoeffer knew which side he was on, but as a matter of tactics, how to resist this in practice, he could not see his way to at the time. So he came to London to be pastor for about 18 months. And he worked very assiduously as a pastor of those two churches. But probably what he hadn't quite expected was that while he might not have been a refugee, plenty of other people coming to London were refugees from the early years of the early days of the Third Reich. And as a German pastor, a sort of semi-public figure, you might say, therefore, on the London scene, people coming from Germany, Jews, opponents of the Nazi regime, people wanting to get out for whatever means, were often turning up, as it were, on his doorstep, wanting help. So he found himself willy-nilly, as well as his work as pastor, as well as his work in the ecumenical peace movement, up to the neck in refugee work. Now, obviously, workers, people coming from nearby Germany to England, were not in the situation of people arriving by boat from Somalia, from Afghanistan or whatever, as they are today. But nevertheless, they were often in a very difficult situation. What did he do about it? Well, to use a familiar phrase, it's come today already, he networked. He got into touch with people who would be able to help. J.H. Oldham, I mentioned earlier in the presentation of the book, the missionary statesman and pioneer of the ecumenical movement in this country, had a very wide network of people. They included Eleanor Iredale, Anglican layperson, very much active in the life and work movement. And of course, he was put in touch also with Bishop George Bell. More on him a bit later. He had all sorts of preoccupations. Some people thought he ought not to have got out of Germany at that time. Karl Barth wrote to him a furious letter saying, get back on the next ship, or the next ship but one. Your house is on fire in Germany, get back there, fight for the confessing church. But he stuck it out in Britain. In a sense, he became destitute himself because he was spending so much time on the telephone and sending telegrams to his church colleagues in Germany, giving them advice on how they should carry on the resistance to Hitler's policy on the church, that the post office at Forest Hill in London had to waive his bill for a whole quarter on compassionate grounds, because he was running out of pocket to meet those bills. And of course, while he was not a refugee himself, I said in the full sense, refugees were streaming in. He received refugee, most of them were friends he'd already known in Germany, to his manse at Sydenham. J.H. Oldham told Bishop Bell time that Bonhoeffer was really concerned about the refugees. He said, about half are Jews and are fairly well looked after by the Jewish community. The other half are in a bad way, and Bonhoeffer is in touch with several cases of actual destitution. Their anxieties increased in some instances by not knowing whether their permit will be renewed every 6 months. He worked with the Quakers Refugee Committee for Professional Workers and its director, Mary Ormerod, at Friends House in Euston Road. It's interesting, Mike was saying about our previous meeting in 2013, back in London in 2013. It was at Friend's house, and evidently Bonhoeffer was quite a familiar visitor to that place. He badgered Baron Schroeder, head of the banking firm, and chairman of the Association of German Congregations in England. His two congregations at Sydenham and Aldgate made special collections for refugees. In some sense, it's a familiar story: personal hospitality, help with friends, raising funds, and so on. So he was immersed in the refugee scene. Now, that was quite consistent with the line he'd already taken while still a pastor or a teacher in Berlin, because in summer 1933, he'd written a paper called The Church and the Jewish Question, stating in no uncertain terms that the Church has an unconditional obligation to come to the aid of all victims of oppression, whether or not they were Christians. It also had an obligation to question the state on the legitimacy of its actions, and if necessary, not just to bind up the victims crushed beneath the wheel, but, as Juliet said this morning, to put a spoke in the wheel to stop it. And his experience with the refugees was evidently increasing his commitment to that line. He wrote to a Swiss pastor and friend, Erwin Sutz, in September 34, and his impatience overcomes him. He says, "It is time for a final break with our theologically grounded reserve about whatever is being done by the state." And he quotes a verse from the book of Proverbs: "Speak out for those who cannot speak." Who in the church today still remembers that this is the very least the Bible asks of us in such times as these? Well, in May 35, Bonhoeffer left London and did go back to Germany to be director of the illegal seminary of the Confessing Church at Finkenwalde in Eastern Germany. But he was not permitted to forget it, the refugee scene, because it was a family matter for him. His twin sister, Sabina, had married an academic in Germany named Gerhard Leibholz, who was an expert in constitutional law in the University of Göttingen, and whose family background on his parents' and grandparents' side was Jewish. So under Nazi racial laws and doctrine, he was what's called non-Aryan. Non-anyone, of course, is a way of diminishing, negating a person who they are. And as the years went on in the 1930s, like so many others, the Leibholzes, Sabina and Gert, and their two young daughters were in increasing danger. And it was with the help of Bishop George Bell that they were able to get out of Germany. Bonhoeffer and his close friend Eberhard Bethge, one of his former students, saw them safely to the Swiss border. They got out, found their way through France to England, where they were until the end of the war. So refugee was very much a personal family matter for Bonhoeffer. Now, of course, people like that were relatively well off, materially speaking, although they couldn't bring funds out of Germany, but they were well off in terms of receptions from friends, colleagues, even family already in England. They were relatively well looked after. That was until the war, when many German refugees, even those who had fled because they were opposed to Hitler, were interned as enemy aliens. Many of the men were sent to the Isle of Man for detention, including Gerhard Leibholz. Bishop Bell was one of the chief people who spoke on their behalf and said, this is nonsense. They shouldn't be in these detention camps. These are the people who are actually have been endangering themselves in opposing Hitler. Many of them were transferred onwards to the United States or Australia or other countries. The Leibholzers were reunited in London. Gerhard found work in teaching in the University of Oxford. And he worked closely with people like J.H. Oldham and again with Bishop Bell. Now, the Leibholz family, Sabina, wrote a book about their experiences, and it's very worthwhile to ponder and read it. It's called Bonhoeffer's Portrait of a Family. And Sabina writes very movingly about their time in England, on the hostility they still encountered, although they were opposed to Hitler. Let it be known they were still, treated with ostracism by neighbors and people who said, take the line that the only good German is a dead German. And she writes about the experience of exile for her and her children. Indeed, one of the most interesting books about Bonhoeffer was written by Eberhard Bethge, among many books he wrote, called Bonhoeffer, Exile and Martyr. Bonhoeffer's treatment of the experience of exile is moving to read. Ultimately, at the end, the Leibholzers were very grateful to have been in England. Sabina summed it all up by saying, England relieved our souls. That was a positive experience for them in the end. But it's time now to divert slightly, and I mentioned Bishop Bell several times already. It's time to make a slight diversion and attend to him as Bonhoeffer's closest English friend and collaborator. So, Matt, just in case people don't know what Bishop Bell looked like, we'll just see the picture of him now, the second picture. Bishop George Bell, Bishop of Chichester, by 1938, in fact, he was a senior member of the Bishop Bench, and so had a seat in the House of Lords. And by then also he was the leading British figure on the ecumenical scene, in that he was the chairman of the Universal Council for Life and Work and a formative figure in the foundation of the World Council of Churches, which came formally into being in 1938, although of course not inaugurated until after the Second World War in 1948. Right, that was Bell. Thanks, Matt. We can carry on with prosaic stuff now. His voice, Bell's voice, was ever more loudly raised. Not only had he become chair of the International Christian Commission for Refugees, but now having had a seat in the House of Lords, his voice was very much more that of a public witness. And by 1938, the situation of refugees became ever more critical. In November of that year came the dreadful events of Kristallnacht in Germany, when Nazi mobs rampaged through much of Germany, attacking shops, businesses owned by Jews, burning synagogues, and much else too. Terrible event which sent shockwaves around Europe. More and more were desperate to get out of Germany. There was an estimated 30,000 refugees from Germany in England at that time, although I always find it difficult to get see what bigger figures meant, because at any one time, many of those would be in transit onwards, particularly to the United States. Pressure was on for more to come. But in February 1939, just 3 months after Kristallnacht, Bell was invited by the Jewish Historical Society to give a public lecture in London, and he chose the title Humanity and the Refugees. And I want to quote from it, some relatively lengthy quotes, for two reasons. First, it gives what I'm sure Bell and Bonhoeffer must have been talking about when they had opportunities to meet again at this time. Bonhoeffer came to London in early 1939, various reasons, and also in London on his way back to Germany from his visit to the United States in August that year. And in itself, as well, the second reason I give is that it's a remarkable lecture in itself. It's very long. I'm not going to read all of it, of course. It goes into the history of how Britain and other countries have been dealing with refugees over the centuries, and of course in recent and contemporary history, full of facts and figures, as Bell's speeches often were, but always imbued with passion. And in itself, it's worth hearing now, because I think we'll agree it's a case of Bell being dead still speaks to our situation. So I'm going to read it now. This is the sort of occasion when I can pretend to be a bishop for a while, which I always enjoy. Mr. Chairman, I am not a statesman. I speak simply as a fellow minister of religion who feels the plight of the refugees upon his conscience. But I believe that if only we could get the national conscience and the consciences of other nations aroused, the statesmen who must contrive the proper solution will attack their task with decision. And because they are determined, will succeed. I believe myself that it is possible to absorb in this country and other European countries a far greater number of Jewish, Christian, and other refugees than have yet been envisaged. In France, apart from the Spaniards now pouring in, they already have 250,000 refugees, including 40,000 Jews. In Switzerland, with a population of 5 million, there are 15,000. In England, till the other day, there were only 11,000 German refugees. It involves planning, of course, but actual experience has proved that the employment of skilled refugees in England has created work for our own people and reduced unemployment. And apart from entry into the labour market, people in this country should be able and willing to receive a far larger number of refugees than have yet found an entry, whether in transit to other countries or in homes for the older people, as well as the children now being introduced under a generous scheme for education in English schools. I agree, says Bell, that all liberal countries in the New World, as well as in the Old World, should organize the right of asylum and assure the refugees of an undisturbed place in the community which has given them shelter. But the right of asylum, which carries with it the true kind of hope and encouragement, is that which is given in countries and in circumstances which allow new scope for creative living and afford the refugee the chance to make the fullest contribution of his own gifts to the wealth of a community. I have spoken long enough, says Bell. Permit me a few remarks only in conclusion. The movement of the refugees is an immense movement, and even in the last week, the flood has grown through the coming of many thousands from Spain. There are signs that it may grow larger yet for a while if the clouds of persecution extend to Hungary, Romania, Poland, and Lithuania. But an end will come. Justice, mercy, liberty will reassert their sway. The oppression will cease as it has ceased before. Belief in God and the lessons of history forbid us to despair. And it is a very good augury for a more liberal attitude all round, that the sympathy and generosity of the public have increased in a remarkable way since the events of November. That's Kristallnacht. In the meantime, we must do everything we can to help the victims of all classes and occupations. And this everything we can means more than philanthropy or private charity. I cannot conceal my admiration of the magnificent activities of the Jewish community for their co-religionists, and for some of my co-religionists too. The Friends, the Quakers, have done much. The academic and industrial and other organizations have done much. And the Christian churches are doing far more than they have done before. But the refugee problem on the scale it has reached today is a problem which the state itself cannot escape. It is a problem which not only cannot begin to be solved without determined government action, but is of such a character that if governments continue to let it drift, it may poison our whole civilization. The collaboration of the governments in a determined way and using their financial resources is the only possible cure. Everyone must sympathize deeply with the present preoccupations of prime ministers and cabinets. Their burden is extraordinarily heavy, but the refugee problem is inextricably bound up with the peace problem. Prime ministers and their cabinets cannot afford to be passive here, for it is an essential part of the whole business of creating a true international order. The problem of the refugee is a political and economic problem which cannot be solved unless the governments are determined that it shall be. It is a task which requires generosity and courage and insight in the heads of the governments and their advisors in the New World and in the Old. It is a task, the proper handling of which will make all the difference, not only to men and women living today, but to posterity. For the problem of the refugee is the problem also of humanity. The problem of the refugee is the problem also of humanity. Bell was speaking 84 years ago. How do you account for what has happened since and where we are today? Well, in 1939, when that was given, soon the world was sliding into war. And for Bonhoeffer, that meant isolation back in Germany, as well as his work for the Confessing Church and his entry with other members of his family and friends into political conspiracy to overthrow the Nazi regime. At one level, again, he was removed from the refugee scene. In another level, he was brought close to it, because his role in the conspiracy took him on a number of occasions of visits abroad to be a kind of go-between between the resistors in Germany and churches and, he hoped, governments abroad as well. 3 to Switzerland, in particular Geneva, the headquarters of the infant World Council of Churches coming into being. He shared with them information about the resistance, and they shared with him about what ecumenical work was happening, in particular work planning, reconstruction and relief in Europe. Because of course Geneva was at the nerve center of so much of the international aid effort for refugees. The Red Cross was there, of course, and so was the Jewish Council for Refugee Relief as well. And there was really was a properly ecumenical international interfaith effort going on. And during his visits to Geneva, he twice met with a remarkable Frenchman who was the secretary of the French YMCA, Charles Guillon, G-U-I-L-L-I-O-N. He was the secretary of the French YMCA, and he was mayor and sometime pastor of the little village of Le Chambon, high up on the Massif Central in France, which was became a remarkable secret center during the war, during the Nazi occupation, for rescue and hiding Jewish children. Several hundred, it's believed, were saved from the Holocaust by the villagers of the Chambon and surrounding villages. Hidden secretly in homes, hidden, as it were, in schools, among the other children going there, and eventually, in many cases, secreted over the border into Switzerland, where the World Council of Churches staff and others were ready to receive them. Extraordinary story. Perhaps you know the book Village of Secrets, which tells their story. But Charles Guillon, because he was ex-mayor and he was had general credentials as a relief worker, was able to visit Geneva several times. And on his visits there, he and Bonhoeffer talked about this work. So Bonhoeffer felt that he was very much in a sense as a co-conspirator with these people who in France who were risking so much of their safety and their lives even for this work. That was his milieu in which he was immersed. Interesting, Le Chambon for a time became a refuge among for other people to Albert Camus, the novelist who was busy writing his book about the plague at the time as an analogy of resistance to the Nazi occupation. And in Geneva, Bonhoeffer was spent time particularly with Alfred Freudenberg, German pastor, but co-opted by the World Council for organizing the relief operation. So this was still very much the milieu in which he was operating. With some tragic irony, after the war, it was through Alfred Freudenberg that the news came to the Bonhoeffer family in England that both Dietrich and his brother Klaus had not survived Hitler's revenge for the conspiracy and the assassination attempt. So Bonhoeffer was still immersed in the refugee milieu and those risking their lives to save them. And we can detect how Bonhoeffer's mind was being shaped during these years, 1940 to 43, before his imprisonment. More and more, it was a journey of identifying with the displaced, the uprooted, and the threatened. And it was at Christmas 1942, his last Christmas of freedom, you might say, that he wrote for family and friends in the conspiracy an essay called After 10 Years, which is a reflection on experiences they've had as resistors, working undercover, in great danger, often uncertain of the consequences of what they were attempting. Here, the privileged Bonhoeffer, secure, middle-class, upper academic background, pastor with professional status, was being led into a rather different place from where to view the world. And he concludes this essay, After 10 Years, with a paragraph called The View from Below, The View from Below, in which he says, "It remains an experience of incomparable value that we have for once learned to see the great events of world history from below, from the perspective of the outcasts, the suspects, the maltreated, the powerless, the oppressed and reviled, in short, from the perspective of the suffering. This is of incomparable value," he says, "because if it's accepted in humility, it can cleanse their hearts from vain notions of power and greatness and opens up a true basis for exploring the meaning of the world in contemplation and action. It's a place, therefore, of hope." Now, can we just show, Matt, the third picture of Bonhoeffer gave you, because I want to show it next to in quick succession. No, sorry, can we go back one? Oh, that one, that's the one, yes. This was this is a poignant picture because it was the last meeting of Dietrich with his sister Sabina in August 1939, when he was on way back to Germany after his stay in the United States, his short-lived stay in the United States. And it's, I think it's among the most beautiful pictures ever taken of him, because there he seems very much well-fed, well-clothed, very much at ease, but talking with Sabina. And as I say, he was shortly to go back into Germany and to his fate there, though staying for a time in contact as much as he could with Sabina and her husband. Now we go to the next picture, the last picture. That's right. A rather different Bonhoeffer, the prisoner. Not so well dressed. The only garb he could have in prison, fairly shabby. And he looks different, doesn't he? He looks thinner. He looks more harassed. He looks more under pressure. Yes, it was not long after writing that After 10 Years essay that Bonhoeffer was arrested and began his 2-year imprisonment in Berlin. Now, I might say not a lot he now himself could do about the refugees or about anything. It was now a matter of maintaining his silence under interrogation for his own sake and those of his family and friends in the conspiracy. Nothing much he could do very much about refugees or anything else. But there are profound implications for what we've been talking about today and can be relevant to us today in the poems he wrote in cell 92 of Tegel prison in Germany. Now, it's very surprising. He'd never written poems, as far as we know, before then. All his writing was sort of academic, theological, philosophical, or serious matters, even in prison, serious matters to his friends about his life and reflections on life and faith. Very surprising that he now turns suddenly to writing poems. At least 9 of them we know of. Now, when people suddenly start writing poetry, it indicates that something new is happening in their life, or they're in trouble or despair, or they're seeing something new they haven't seen before, or they've fallen in love. And in Bonhoeffer's case, you could say it was all of these, in fact, at this time in his life was affecting him. Thanks, Matt. We'll proceed just without Bonhoeffer for the moment. The poem he wrote in June 1944, after a visit from his fiancée, Maria von Wedemeyer, whom he'd become engaged to just before his arrest, much younger than himself, but a very joyous, passionate, now an anxious relationship. The first poem in this group he wrote in prison, it's called The Past. You left, beloved bliss and pain so hard to love. What shall I call you? Life, anguish, ecstasy, my heart of my own self apart, the past. The door slammed shut and locked. I hear your steps depart, resound, then slowly fade. What remains for me? Joy, torment, longing. I know this, just this, you left and all is past. The door was, he said, slammed shut and locked on Maria and all she represents of the past and its blessings and the hope for the future. Thoughts of a person suddenly dispossessed of so much dear to him. Dispossession, disruption, displacement. All the feelings, perhaps, of many a refugee. Life, he says, what have you done to me? Why did you come? Why did you pass by? Past, when you flee from me, are you still not my past, my very own? This poem to Maria was the very first he wrote. The other last poem we know of he wrote in prison is known to many of us because it's entered into our hymn books. The poem he wrote called By Powers of Good, So Graciously Protected. It was written, in fact, after he'd been moved from Tegel prison to the more ghastly environment of the Gestapo cellars in central Berlin at the end of 1944. And the verses 3 and 4, in their contrast, are so poignant. A prayer to God. And should you offer us the cup of suffering, though heavy, brimming full of bitter brand, we'll thankfully accept it, never flinching from your good heart and your beloved hand. But should you wish now once again to give us the joys of this world and its glorious sun, then we'll recall what past times have brought us, and then our life belongs to you alone. So on the one hand, the dread possibility of no release, except possibly death. On the other hand, the longed for, hoped against hope for, the reopening of that door slammed shut, the return to life and love and beauty. Both and having to live in the unremitting uncertainty, day after day, week after week, month after month, of not knowing which it shall be. Living with such uncertainty, of course, the problem for many a refugee, having to hope, a hope that might be dashed or just fade away. There's another poem, Fortune and Calamity, describes the impact of some events as such that they first cannot be understood as either good or bad for us. Fortune and calamity, the rush to strike us and overwhelm, are at first barely distinguishable. Like meteors hurled from far above the earth, brilliant and threatening, they steer their course over our heads. Victims stand dumbstruck before the rubble of their lustreless everyday existence. I think that can only reflect the experience of the heavy bombing raids that were going on in Berlin at the time. Victims stand dumbstruck before the rubble of their lustreless everyday existence. Other poems, of course, are well known to us. I've too many to quote. Who Am I is that poem where he's driven to ask which is his real self, the outwardly unflappable person, always cheerful and in control of circumstances, or the person he often feels himself to be, often afraid, confused, helpless in face of circumstances. And he's no answer to the question of who am I, except the answer of whose am I? Whoever I am, thou knowest me, O God, I am thine. Refugees are liable to find themselves in a strange and alien environment, and there's no doubt that Tegel military prison in Berlin, as an institution and a community collection of fellow prisoners, was totally unlike anything Bonhoeffer had experienced before. Many of the prisoners were young soldiers who'd fallen foul of military law, often at very petty levels, others much more serious cases in facing death penalty. Night Voices in Tegel, the longest of these poems, in which Bonhoeffer, sleepless on a hot summer's night, imagines hearing the sighs of troubled prisoners of all kinds. I hear half-grown lads happy whispering, as in their innocent dreams they feast. I hear them tugging at their covers, hiding from hideous nightmare's beast. I hear older men sighing and faintly breathing, quietly for their great journey bearing. Justice and injustice they've seen come and go. Now it's the immortal, eternal they long to know. And through them he hears the wider community of Germany, troubled, guilty, angry Germany at large. It becomes a kind of extended prayer of confession on their behalf. So while his journey was caused by dispossession, disruption, displacement, and loss, being plunged into this alien environment, the most natural response would have been withdrawal and inward mental isolation, the nearest thing to physical escape he could manage. There was, in fact, a plot by some friends and friendly prison warders to get Bonhoeffer out of prison. And there was almost ready to go on this. But then suddenly dangers re-emerged in October 1944, when incriminating files on Bonhoeffer's circle of conspirators was discovered, and it was thought that to get him out of prison then would put the rest of the family in great danger. But Bonhoeffer copes with this, or tries to cope with it, by entering into deeper relationship with his environment, identifying with it in intercessory service, intercessory prayer and advice for how prisoners should be treated during air raids. And he ponders, again, well, we haven't got time to go into this side, the biblical theme of exile. Now, at the end of that poem I read earlier, Fortune and Calamity, after that scene of people standing senseless before the rubble of their lives, he writes of what may yet be hoped for. He doesn't write in terms of sudden, massive, grand, superhuman reconstruction, but of what is more human, immediate and enduring. This is the hour of faithfulness, the hour of mother and lover, the hour of friend and brother. Faithfulness transfigures all calamity and quietly envelops it in gentle, celestial resplendence. Some people we've heard today have already talked about what the personal extension of friendship and continuing with people means to people who apparently have lost everything. Big challenges, very modestly genuine human response in calamity. Could go on many of these other poems too. Talks about his poem, The Death of Moses, praying that future generations of his people will learn from their own story of seeking corn in Egypt. Those who once themselves ate bread of foreign lands will not ignore the aliens' empty hands. In all these poems, coming to, I hope, rushing to an end now, Bonhoeffer, I'm suggesting, is not only a voice calling us to take up the cause of those in need who cannot speak for themselves, but through articulating his own experience, without actually being a refugee himself, he's inviting us to appreciate what being a refugee so often means in terms of their experience of disruption, loss, displacement, disorientation, having to live in the no man's land between both hope and fear, yet keeping us open to the possibilities of grace. And his alienation is overcome through the grace of being able to identify with those in that no man's land. Here is where, talking of Christian responses to the migration crisis, we have to speak of what is central to our faith, as Bishop Rose was saying. This is where we meet the question that is not just another item on our agenda, but is our belief as to who God is and where God is. That we are engaged in the refugee challenge with the call to discipleship, the transformative change asked for us in our social relations. We're being asked about God. What sort of gospel, what sort of God are we as Christians proclaiming in our worship, our teaching and actions or inactions? Is it the God who only inhabits our comfort zone with us and guaranteeing our life within it? Or is it the God who is beyond the safe boundary among the suffering? Close with one of his profoundest prison poems. I find it. Christians and heathens. People go to God when they're in need, plead for help, pray for blessing and bread, for rescue from their sickness, guilt and death. So do they all of them, Christians and heathens. People go to God when God's in need, find God poor, reviled, without shelter or bread. See God devoured by sin, weakness and death. Christians stand by God in God's own pain. God goes to all people in their need, fills body and soul with God's own bread, goes for Christians and heathens to Calvary's death, and forgives them both. I said at the beginning that we should think of refugees as a peace issue rather than simply a human rights issue, because in this issue that God seeks to make God's peace with us and with the suffering and with the sins of humankind. It's about our relationship with refugees and their relationships with us. It is, as George Bell said, about our humanity. It's about our capacity to be truly human. The attitudes we take to refugees are beset with our anxieties as to how we can cope with them. We fear the stranger, not just because they're strange, but because maybe we doubt our ability to befriend them, and we should be found wanting, and we don't want to risk that. But we're not being asked to give them something that only we have and have in too short supply, namely our compassion, where we are asked for that. We're being asked first and foremost simply to meet them, hear their stories, and let them tell us what they're actually looking for. Before long, we may, as people have already hinted to us in these contributions we've had today, we will find them sharing with us what they would like to give us and bring to our society. Then our humanity is renewed and grows. Bonhoeffer himself emphasized this again and again, that human life is life in relationship. The freedom is a relationship between people, including above all, the freedom of love. I know it's a very homespun piece of wisdom, but when over 50 years ago, my wife and I were expecting our first child, like many new parents, we were wondering if we would cope with it, what the baby would be like, and even whether we would actually like the baby when it arrived. We were told by an experienced mother in a Derbyshire coal mining village, "It's all right, duck, they bring their own love with them." Now, obviously, children don't only bring love, they bring problems and challenges, like migrants do. But it is part of our real human experience, and true to the God-given nature of human life as relational and designed for community, that our most significant and precious fulfillments come not from what we do or give, but what we receive as gifts that emerge in the mutual encounters between ourselves and the others. This can never be guaranteed in advance, but approached in expectant trust and hope that this is where God is to be found and met. I go back to that statement he made in 1934 about the peace movement. There is no way to peace along the way of safety, for peace must be dared. It is the great venture. It can never be made safe. I stop there.
Thank you indeed. That's a very provoking contribution to end our discussions today. In my own case, I was just thinking how a couple of years ago, Project Bonhoeffer trustees were discussing how to perhaps use the poetry, following one or two of us having listened to a lecture that had been taking place in Leeds, and we still have not sort of taken that further, but I'm sure today we've got some clue as to how that might be done. So the practical inspirations are there, as well as the personal ones to be gained from today. I don't know if anybody else has got any other comments they wish to add to about the day and what you think we should be taking from it. If you like to write to Liz, I'm sure you've got her email. That's one thing that you can do. I'm sure Keith, Project Bonhoeffer, will certainly be interested in any other reactions of any kind that we can build on for the future triennium of the program. And I think that will draws to a close the substantive items. But Keith, Alan, you want to say something? I know.
Well, just before we do, Matt was indicated he wanted to ask a question. I think we could dispense with the chat at the end of the day. Ben, do you want to ask Keith a question?
Sorry, I was Keith.
Yes.
My father was actually on the Isle of Man as an internee.
Wow.
And he said it was one of the happiest times of his life because you had the Amadeus quartets, university professors, and all sorts of other people. And, you know, he always said that to me. The tragic bit was that about half of them were sent on something called the Arandora Star to Canada, which was torpedoed. So another part of the family, something like 2,000 people, I think, lost their lives in that tragic attack by the Germans.
Yeah. Yes, it was, I mean, refugee communities often create their own cultural life and their richness, don't they? And bring something to it. I mean, people, on a jokey set of mine, people used to say in Oxford, there were, like the Leipolds, there were so many German academic refugees in Oxford that if you wanted to improve your German, just hop on the bus to North Oxford and
Yeah.
your conversation there.
Okay.